afternoon, everyone. You're listening to CaMMVetsmedia on WVOX AM 1460 and heard around the world on WVOX.com. This is Jeff McGurk with Ken Cracer bringing you this half hour of discussion of issues related to veterans and the active military. Now, here's Ken.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone listening to WVOX and CaMMVetsmedia. We cover cadets, midshipmen, the military, and veterans proudly since 2008. And Jack, first I want to say thank you for covering last week so I could go on a family trip, which was a great day, and I appreciate your covering it. A lot happening on the world scene, and I spent most of my morning looking at what happened at West Point and in Orange County yesterday. They got nearly 8 inches of rain.
Wow.
Within a couple of hours, starting about 3 o'clock, and that's, as everyone knows, you got Bear Mountain, you got all those mountains, and all the rain just runs down the mountains and the hills to the river and right through West Point. One person was killed, sadly, in the Highland Falls area. But we'll talk more about that in the second half. Let's talk about our national and international stories.
All right, I'll start off with what's happening in Ukraine. The Turkish President Erdogan met with President Volodymyr Zelensky, and he believes now that Ukraine deserves NATO membership. We're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. But as for now, it's actually now been over 500 days since the invasion of Ukraine. And last week there was a story I brought up about it was Army General Mark Milley saying that they were considering sending cluster munitions to Ukraine. And then it was announced this week that the U.S. is sending another $800 million in aid to Ukraine, which includes cluster munitions, and as well as 64 Stryker and Bradley fighting vehicles, air defense missiles, and anti-mine equipment. But Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor to President Biden, said it was a very difficult decision and defended the use of the cluster munitions. Now, the cluster munitions are weapons that break open in the air and disperse smaller bomblets across a large stretch of area when detonated. Proponents of banning the cluster bombs contend that they kill indiscriminately and endanger civilians long after their use. The Human Rights Watch, was an international advocacy group, published a report last week that said both sides have used cluster munitions that have killed Ukrainian citizens and urged the U.S. not to supply them. Now, back in 2008, more than 100 countries signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which bans the use, production, and stockpiling of the munitions. However, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States did not sign this treaty. But the cluster munitions can be launched from high-mobility artillery rocket systems, which we know have already been sent to Ukraine, and 155 millimeter howitzers, which the U.S. has provided to Ukraine. And now the U.S. has provided more than $41.3 billion in aid since the invasion started in February of 2022. But very controversial decision now to send these cluster weapons over there, Ken.
Yeah, I would tend to be against it personally. What's happening is the Russians are mining heavily the areas that they've taken over to create a defensive position almost on the whole line of the country. And that creates the same danger that someday, someone said this weekend, well, after this war is over, you're going to have a massive effort to clean up this land, to remove mines and ordnance that has not gone off, such as these cluster munitions. And you're just turning the whole area into an uninhabitable place. And so doing this is just taking that a step further. I would kind of like to see the U.S. Provide some more warplanes to Ukraine. What the Biden administration says is that if they don't help the Ukrainians with munitions, the war's going to go on longer and longer. They need to help Ukraine win and win soon. And right now you got a stalemate, and the Russians have put out all these mines, so it's very hard to go through to recapture land that's been mined. Mm-hmm. And so I have to get an expert more in that. Excuse me. Yeah, it's really becoming. I mean, any war is nasty, but this is getting to be a really ugly situation. It's devastating. You see some of the Ukraine cities that have been hit by artillery, where almost every building in the city has been destroyed. And hopefully, we don't know what happened. The whole Wagner revolt last week. We don't know what impact that's going to have on the Russians. because the regular Russian army struggled in the first year of the war, but they seem to be getting their strategy a little bit better, at least. But it's becoming like World War I all over again.
And also in that aid package, you have additional ammunition for the high-mobility artillery rocket systems, ammunition for the Patriot air defense systems, which the Ukrainians have been using both of those systems effectively to shoot down Russian missiles, as well as I said, 32 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 32 Stryker armored personnel carriers. Also, you mentioned the Russian mining. The U.S. is also sending mine-clearing equipment over there to help the Ukrainians. So a lot going over to Ukraine.
Well, the question is, how fast is all that going to get there? It's been one of the concerns. The howitzer artillery shells, the 155s, that's the mainstay of the U.S. Army's artillery. And well, they're developing some new long-range precision fires. That's their bread and butter artillery. There's a question that the Ukrainians are using up so much of it in this war of attrition that it's starting to affect U.S. stockpiles, which the Secretary of the Army specifically said when I was in the room in Washington last October was not going to happen. But now there's so much artillery being fired at each other right now. They're depleting the Ukrainian stockpile, and then also they're having to go deeper into the U.S. stockpile. So that's again, it's like World War I all over again. Indeed,
and Russian fighter jets have harassed American drones over Syria for 3 days in a row last week. U.S. military said in a statement that tension between Russian and U.S. troops is not uncommon in Syria, as both countries conduct patrols on the ground as well as over flights. And the first friction occurred was Wednesday morning last week when Russian military aircraft engaged in unsafe and unprofessional behavior as 3 U.S. MQ-9 drones were conducting a mission against the Islamic State group, U.S. military said. And on Thursday, the U.S. military said Russian fighter aircraft flew incredibly unsafe and unprofessionally against both French and U.S. aircraft over Syria. And the Russian aircraft, Lieutenant General Alex Grinkovich, head of the U.S. Air Force Central Command, said in a statement last Friday the Russian aircraft flew 18 unprofessional close passes that caused the drones to react to avoid unsafe situations. Yeah, weird, scary situation there in Syria. We have these Russian jets kind of harassing U.S. drones and also getting a little close to U.S. and French fighters as well.
Well, I kind of like the idea that a U.S. Air Force drone is a match for a Soviet fighter plane, or Russian fighter plane. Now, I highly recommend that our listeners look up Richard Engel's special that he did on Friday night, really profiling the leader of the Wagner Group and his ascension to power and what his current situation was. But one of the things they talked about was in Syria, that the Russians and the ISIS groups and a few others tried to attack a oil refinery, a big complex that the U.S. was helping to defend. And they kept moving forward, thinking they were having some success against the local troops. And then the U.S. Army decided they'd had enough and retaliated against the Russian troops and blew them away. And it was a direct conflict between U.S. and Russian troops that happened in Syria. That sort of, I gotta find out exactly when that happened, but it was a great, it was an interesting story that when the U.S. Army is provoked, they know how to fight back.
Absolutely. And briefly, I touched on NATO earlier a while ago, but what's happening there, Sweden and Turkey have made some progress in talks aimed at overcoming President Erdogan, President of Turkey's objections to Sweden joining NATO. But gaps still remain in their positions, and their leaders will meet this week to discuss them. Fearing for their security, Sweden and neighboring Finland ended their longstanding policy of military non-alignment after the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 and applied to join NATO. Only Turkey and Hungary have delayed Sweden's membership. The other 29 allies and Sweden have all said that the country has done enough to satisfy Turkey's demands. Now, Sweden changed its constitution, modified anti-terror laws, and lifted arms embargoes on Turkey, among other concessions. But Turkey accuses Sweden of being too lenient towards groups that Ankara says pose a security threat, including militant Kurdish groups and people associated with the 2016 coup attempt. NATO requires the unanimous approval of all 31 members to expand. Finland did join NATO. But I said Hungary is also holding up the approval of Sweden to join NATO. Not really clear why, what their concerns are.
Well, Jack, one of the news shows went into it and said that Turkey's problem with Sweden is that some individuals in Sweden offended some religious groups in Turkey by burning a flag or some religious item, and it offended people in Turkey, and the president was sticking up. The President Biden, according to news reports, is now offering Turkey more F-16 fighter planes and equipment that goes with it to gain Turkey's approval to allow Sweden to join NATO. And they're hoping it can happen at this NATO meeting that President Biden is on his way to. That's going to happen in Lithuania this week.
All right, we'll definitely keep an eye on that. You've been listening to CaMMVetsmedia on WVOX AM 1460, heard around the world on WVOX.com. We'll be right back after this brief AP news break, so stay tuned.